Most people are other people. Their thoughts are someone else's opinions. Their lives a mimicry. Their passions a quotation. These lines were written by Oscar Wilde in a letter now known as De Profundis. Wilde had been imprisoned in 1895, and from Reading jail, he wrote an impassioned letter of over 50,000 words to his former friend and lover, Lord Alfred Douglas. There's some irony in Wilde writing these lines from prison, as he lived out the very real consequences of refusing to live and think like other people. The quote remains popular, judging by how often it appears in these very sinister YouTube shorts.
Their lives a mimicry, their passions a quotation.
I think the quote still resonates, because in an age of algorithms, personal taste seems impossibly hard to curate. The online world is financed by advertising, and advertisers rely on us wanting what other people want. Fashion microtrends have been a staple of the TikTok algorithm for years now, to the point that magazine headlines are warning us about the death of personal style, aesthetic burnout, and overconsumption. I think it's fair to say that a lot of the media we watch is also derivative. In my last video, I talked about the IP oversaturation problem in cinema. In 2024, all 10 of the highest grossing films featured characters and stories from existing IP, and 7 of them were sequels. A lot of critics have pointed to the death of mid-budget cinema and how inflated budgets mean blockbusters are overly reliant on IP to draw audiences. Outside of cinema, it's increasingly common to see accusations of copyright infringement. In April of 2020, the first book of the paranormal romantasy series Crave was published. It quickly caught on BookTok, and today Crave and its sequels have sold over 3.5 million copies globally. However, in 2022, its author, Tracy Wolfe, was sued for copyright infringement by an unpublished novelist, Lynn Freeman. To summarise a very messy situation, Freeman and Wolfe have the same agent, and Freeman asserts that large portions of her unpublished novel appear in Wolfe's books, insinuating that her former agent passed off ideas and maybe even early drafts to Wolfe. In an article in The New Yorker, Katie Waldman writes, "All genre fiction, and arguably all fiction, is patterned on tropes, or received bits of narrative. Romantasy's reliance on tropes poses a challenge for questions of copyright. Traditionally, the law protects the original expression of ideas, not the ideas themselves. The wild proliferation of intensely derivative romantasies has complicated this picture. The more specific the trope, the harder it is to argue that such a thing as an original detail exists." Unlike cinema, fiction isn't so dominated by an IP problem. Instead, commercial fiction is very heavily picked up and marketed based on what has proved recently sellable. If you're pitching a book to agents or publishers, you're usually asked for comp titles. This means 1 or 2 books which are similar to yours and which have recently sold well. Comp titles often play a part in marketing too. When I was researching Greek myth retellings, I was surprised by just how many of the retellings I looked at had Madeline Miller comparisons featured prominently in their marketing. Given the Song of Achilles had sold somewhere over 2 million copies, it's becoming proof of success for all other retellings. This does lead to a kind of homogenization of fiction. Agents and publishers are always looking for the next Dolly Alderton or Madeline Miller, and so the books that get multi-million-dollar publishing contracts are often those which are, at least superficially, similar to other recent bestsellers. Copyright cases like Lynn Freeman's are probably going to get increasingly hard to prove as plot lines and tropes get reused. That said though, it's worth remembering that tropes are nothing new. Joseph Campbell's research into archetypes essentially underpins all modern-day tropes, and although authors are much more self-aware about using them as marketing tools, I don't think tropes are entirely to blame for unoriginality. In fact, I think it's easy to get carried away with the idea that all good fiction should be completely original. The study of literature often involves following chains of influence to understand how writers took inspiration from or reacted against one another. Many authors, like Edgar Allan Poe, are widely read because they're just very influential. Poe pioneered horror and detective fiction and influenced writers like Agatha Christie, Lovecraft, and Raymond Chandler. He was also very popular in France, translated and championed by Baudelaire, and his style found its fruition ultimately in modernism. Therefore, whether we're trying to understand pulp fiction or modernism, it pays to read Poe. Art is necessarily derivative, and we often study it by studying how artists learn from one another. At its best, chains of influence breed originality, especially when creatives are very conscious about who they're being influenced by. If we want to escape Wilde's conundrum of living and thinking like other people, it pays to study great artists' influences. I think J.R.R. Tolkien is a really good example here for the fact that he was very deliberate about his influences. It's often hard for us to get just how original the Lord of the Rings trilogy was when the books first came out. Before Tolkien, fantasy wasn't a genre so much as a collection of loosely connected works and authors like Lord Dumbzani or Mervyn Peake. Tolkien created both a book series and a model in which future fantasy authors could work, the creation of a total secondary world. Tolkien didn't integrate Greco-Roman mythology into his world as his friend C.S. Lewis did, but favoured Norse, Anglo-Saxon and Finnish myths for his inspiration. Tolkien was a philologist. His day job involved studying ancient texts and using changes in language to unpick history. He was incredibly good at this. He could create vast historic theories by tracing the roots of a single word. The influence of philology can be felt all throughout Lord of the Rings. The lexicography of Middle-earth is heavily derived from Middle and Old English. According to Tolkien, the stories were made rather to provide a world for the languages than the reverse. To me, a name comes first, and the story follows. Given that Tolkien's job involved the study of dead and lost languages, it's no surprise that Middle-earth is shadowed by the weight of lost or unknown history. The Fellowship walk among ruins of fallen civilizations, just as the ancient Britons once walked among the remnants of Rome. There's an Ozymandian sadness to the Lord of the Rings. The weight of history is a constant reminder to the Fellowship of the oblivion they themselves face if they lose. The heart-racking sense of the vanished past is one that moves me supremely, Tolkien once wrote. In an essay on the Lord of the Rings, Ursula Le Guin says, "Careless reading of genuine fantasy will miss not only nuance, it will miss the whole nature and quality of the work. This is what's happened over and over to the Lord of the Rings. Even in the film version, where, though Tolkien's plot is followed faithfully and the ring is destroyed, the focus on violent action and the interminable battle scenes overshadow, and perhaps fatally reduce, the moral complexity and originality of the book, the mystery at its heart." Fantasy which is derivative of Tolkien, and there's a lot of it, especially in the years immediately following Ring's publication, is usually derivative of the aesthetic elements. Elves, dwarves and orcs, battles against the big bad. As Le Guin points out, the things that make Lord of the Rings so original and compelling are the aspects which most copycats tend to miss. In fact, Le Guin herself is a great example of someone who works in the same manner as Tolkien did, with an academic eye and a very deliberate set of historic influences. Le Guin is one of the most beloved science fiction and fantasy authors. In her lifetime, she published over 20 novels and 100 short stories. Her father was a renowned anthropologist, and her mother was an author with a background in psychology. Le Guin's eye for both these disciplines is very sharp. In her explorations of different worlds, she constantly challenges readers to contend with philosophical ideas and to rethink norms of culture and gender. Like all other fantasy authors, Le Guin was working in the model of Tolkien, but her work is never in his shadow. Her Earthsea trilogy is centred around a search for balance, which Le Guin drew from her lifelong study of Taoism. In her hands, every genre convention is an opportunity for subversion. I tend to notice that it's usually genre fiction which takes the blame for being overly conventional, an idea that clearly frustrated Le Guin. Nothing about her work, or Tolkien's for that matter, was conventional. In fact, I think conventionality happens when authors don't really read beyond their own genre, a problem which is exacerbated by the way publishing works. If there's any lesson to take from Tolkien and Le Guin, it's to bring an outsider's eye to fiction, whether it's a philologist's passion for the stories behind language or an anthropologist's eye for detail. Influence works both ways. Often, authors who are overlooked in their lifetimes gain posthumous significance because later creatives were influenced by them. Both Le Guin and Tolkien are themselves very influential, and I think it's this that will ultimately ensure the longevity of their work. The Lord of the Rings has remained popular not just because it's a great read, but because all later fantasy has been shaped in Tolkien's image. You can see this in everything, from filmmaking to music. A band which mightn't have been popular in its heyday is made retrospectively important because they're widely influential on other musicians.
It was the fringe, strange bands that nobody ever bought, like the Velvet Underground, that actually have created modern music.
The Velvet Underground formed in the 1960s. They were known for their raw sound and their close association with Andy Warhol, but during their active years they went largely unrecognised by the mainstream. Brian Eno is famously credited with saying that, although their first album sold only 30,000 copies in its early years, everyone who bought one of those 30,000 copies started a band. Speaking of people who were influenced by everything, there's maybe no better example than David Bowie. It's hard to quantify just how influential he's been on modern music. He was a chameleon, a shapeshifter, constantly creating new onstage personas and reinventing himself.
I got tired of the lie of the rock performer is exactly the same on stage as he is off stage, which in most cases isn't true at all. But so I thought, well, take it a stage further and completely separate the personalities.
In 1969, Bowie had his first mainstream hit, Space Oddity. Inspired by Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, the song is about an astronaut floating far away from Earth as his mind fragments, and it heralded a strange, somber end to the 60s. Bowie's influences were impossibly wide-reaching. He ransacked history and culture for ideas, from makeup to photography, fashion, literature, dance, and mime. He endlessly reinvented himself, creating new characters to escape the old ones. Bowie said, "I always thought that I should change all the time. I stripped myself down, chucked things out and replaced them with a completely new personality. When I saw a quality in someone that I liked, I took it."
I don't know where we're going. I'm just going.
Let's go.
That, in fact, critics they don't imply what's going to happen in art. They can only interface and interrelate with what is actually happening now and maybe revisit the past and give some kind of spin on what happened in the past. Tomorrow's culture is always dictated by the artists. The artists make culture, not the critics.
It's an old cliche about how often critics get things wrong when it comes to who will be big or who will have influence. We've just had the centenary celebrations of The Great Gatsby's publication, a book that wasn't well reviewed when it first came out. Ultimately, like Bowie says, critics can only comment on the present. Artists have the advantage of being able to build chains of influence retrospectively. Van Gogh, for instance, was overlooked in his lifetime. His posthumous fame is thanks partly to the German expressionists and cubists who were inspired by his works. Van Gogh is important not just because his art is beautiful, but because he was influential on other artists.
I can take as many of these as I want.
The Criterion Channel has an amazing series where creatives talk you through their favourite films. It's a wonderful and generous way of really getting to understand your favourite actor or director and where they learn their lessons from. It's tempting to think that if you want to make films like Barry Jenkins, you should watch Moonlight 20 times and mimic it. But really, you should be watching the films that your favourite director watches. Reach for what they are reaching for. Look to your favourite artist's favourite artist if you really want to understand them.
Foundational. Like, there's a film school in this box set.
Many popular writers and artists of the 19th and 20th century are largely forgotten or unread now because they weren't influential. Authors like Marie Corelli or George du Maurier were huge bestsellers in their time, but they just aren't read anymore because we don't feel their influence in the way that we do with Pride and Prejudice or Moby Dick. Colleen Hoover might have sold better than the Bible a couple of years ago, but if artists aren't being influenced by her, her books will probably be forgotten. Stephenie Meyer, for better or worse, is a very important author, not just because she sold well, but because people were influenced by her. The genre of paranormal romance has been forever shaped in her image. Cinema is still a relatively new medium. The actors and directors on the Criterion Channel are helping to pick the films that people might still be watching in 100 years, because they're artists. They have the privilege to choose what they're influenced by. And so, who you choose as your artistic influences is a genuinely powerful question. I'm not sure how much control we have over who we're influenced by, but to the extent that we do, It pays to be like Bowie, to be inspired by everything, to ransack history for inspiration. There's a quote I love from the writer J.F. Martel. Only poor art tries to represent or reproduce, and that is why it generates only cliches, stereotypes, and opinions. Genuine art isn't representational, but demonstrational and imitative. It is deeply implicated in the experiential dimension, all that we associate with consciousness. But whereas most of the time we approach consciousness discursively from an assumed outside perspective, works of art catch it from within. What art gives us is consciousness in action. Not consciousness of the world, but consciousness in the world. I know that when creating art, it's sometimes tempting to just imitate, because it seems like the fastest route to publication, or a record deal, or a viral TikTok. But with AI on the rise, which is just a giant imitation machine, it's more important than ever not to imitate, but to be constantly looking for inspiration everywhere, to look beyond your own medium or place and time, to never lose your hunger for new ideas. The poet Robert Browning spent a lot of his career writing in obscurity. In his later life, his star power grew a bit, but it wasn't until after World War II that critics began to widely acknowledge the influence he had had on 20th century poetry. One of Browning's most widely quoted poems is called Andrea del Sarto. It's about an Italian painter who was overshadowed by his contemporaries, Da Vinci and Michelangelo. The poem is written as a dramatic monologue, as Del Sarto considers what his life could have been, and finally comes to the sobering conclusion that yearning for more is what it means to be an artist. My works are nearer heaven, he says, but I sit here. A man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for?